The sound of the gavel was small, just a piece of wood striking another piece of wood. But inside the Red Hollow County Courthouse, that single crack carried weight. It ended a life. The judge spoke a few final words. Quiet, formal, routine. The land title was transferred. The debt was closed. And just like that, the farm of Warren Hale, a widowed blacksmith and small grain farmer who had worked the same soil for 15 years, was no longer his. 3 seasons of drought had done the damage first. The bank simply finished the work. The house was taken. The horse shed was taken. The fields were taken. Outside the courthouse windows, the valley looked the same as it had yesterday. Brown grass, low hills, thin clouds moving slowly over the ridge. But inside the courtroom, the arithmetic had changed. A man named Edmund Carver, the bank's quiet land agent, slid a folded document across the polished table. The paper made a soft sound against the wood. "There is one parcel remaining," he said calmly. It was not a gift. It was bookkeeping. A strip of land at the far edge of Red Hollow Basin. Rocky ground where plows broke and cattle wandered off looking for grass that wasn't there. Most people in town had forgotten the place even existed. Carver tapped the map with one clean fingernail. "There is a cave on the property," he added. His voice held no optimism. "Old lava tube, basalt rock." He paused, then gave a thin shrug. "It's all that remains." Warren Hale studied the map. A small black mark on the edge of a pale valley, a hole in the earth. Nothing more. He folded the paper once, slowly, and placed it inside his coat. In the same pocket were the last coins he owned, $3.12. Outside, a few townspeople stood near the courthouse steps, pretending not to watch. They had seen this before. Another farm gone. Another man walking away from land that had defeated him. Warren stepped into the afternoon wind without looking back. Somewhere beyond the hills waited a cave in the rock. And that cave was now his entire future. If you're listening to this story tonight, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Out here on the old frontier, every valley had its own hard lessons, and Red Hollow was about to learn one more. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what Warren finds inside that basalt cave. Your support keeps these stories coming. The courthouse door closed behind Warren Hale with a dull wooden thud. He stood for a moment on the steps of Red Hollow's courthouse, the folded deed resting quietly in his coat pocket. The wind moved through the street, carrying dust along the boards of the walkway. No one spoke to him. A few people nodded. Some looked away. In small frontier towns, men understood when another man had just lost everything. Warren turned and began the short walk back to the farm that no longer belonged to him. The house looked the same as it had that morning. The same crooked fence, the same iron pump near the well, the same empty pasture where 2 horses once grazed before the drought had taken them. Inside, the rooms were already hollow. The bank had marked most things for removal. But a few items remained, the kind of things that held little value to a ledger, but meant survival to a man starting over. Warren gathered them quietly. A dull-edged axe leaned against the wall. A broken coal shovel hung beside the door. An oil lantern sat on the kitchen shelf. Near the back room, he found a small sack of barley seed he had saved for a planting that never happened. Then he carried a wooden crate from the shed. Inside were 4 nervous hens, shifting and clucking softly. They would come with him. When everything was loaded into the small handcart he had built years earlier, Warren stood in the doorway one last time. For 15 years, this house had held winter fires, summer storms, and the quiet rhythm of ordinary days. Now it was just lumber and nails belonging to someone else. He pulled the door closed. The latch clicked. Warren did not look back. The road out of Dry Ridge curved west toward the edge of Red Hollow Basin, 6 miles. At first, the land still looked like farmland. Low fences, thin grass, rows of soil turned pale by drought. Then the color began to change. The soil thinned. The grass disappeared. Rock began pushing through the earth like broken teeth. By the time the sun lowered toward the western ridge, the valley floor had turned gray. Granite outcrops rose from the ground in long, jagged lines, and at the base of one steep rock wall, Warren finally saw it, a dark opening in the stone, the mouth of the cave. Cold air drifted slowly from the darkness, carrying the dry mineral smell of old basalt. Warren rolled the cart to the entrance and stopped. For a moment, he listened to the wind moving through the rocks. Then he lifted the crate of hens and set it down on the gravel beside the cave mouth. The birds shifted nervously. The wind sighed again through the stone, and Warren Hale stood at the edge of his new home. Warren Hale did not enter the cave immediately. Men who had spent their lives around mines, wells, and rock cuts learned a simple rule early. Dark holes in the earth were patient places. They could wait. So Warren stayed near the entrance. He gathered loose stones and built a small ring on the gravel. A handful of dry brush and 2 splintered boards from the handcart became kindling. Soon, a small fire crackled against the cooling air. The hens settled in their crate beside the rock wall, feathers puffed against the cold. Warren opened the sack of lentils and ate a slow handful, chewing carefully. The food was plain, but it filled the empty quiet. Night arrived quickly in Red Hollow Basin. The temperature dropped as soon as the sun slipped behind the ridge. The firelight pushed the darkness back a few feet, but beyond that circle, the cave mouth remained a deep, silent black. Then the wind began. At first, it was only a low breath moving through the rocks. Then it found the hollow passages inside the lava tube. The sound changed. A long, hollow whistle moved out of the cave's throat and across the gravel floor. The noise echoed against the stone walls and returned again, softer but stranger. Warren sat still, listening. Every shift of gravel sounded like a step. Every falling pebble rolled through the darkness like something moving closer. The cave did not feel like shelter. It felt like a chamber waiting to close. The fire burned low. The wind kept whispering through the rock. Warren did not sleep. More than once, he studied the dark opening and considered the thought plainly. This might be where he died. A hole in the stone at the edge of a forgotten valley. Morning arrived slowly, not with warmth, but with a pale gray light spreading across the basin. Warren stood, stiff from the cold ground. He lifted the oil lantern from his pack and struck a match. The small flame steadied inside the glass. He turned toward the cave entrance. The darkness waited. Warren stepped forward and raised the lantern. Then he said quietly into the stone, "Let's see what you are." The lantern light pushed only a small circle ahead of Warren Hale as he stepped into the cave. The first stretch was narrow. Rough basalt walls pressed close on both sides, forcing him to angle his shoulders through parts of the passage. The floor sloped gently downward, covered with loose gravel that shifted under each careful step. The air felt different inside. Not warm exactly, but not as cold as the wind outside. Warren walked slowly, holding the lantern high. 10 feet, 20, 30. The tunnel stretched deeper into the rock. The sound of his boots echoed in strange ways. Some steps returned immediately. Others came back seconds later, drifting through the dark like distant replies. Then, after nearly 70 feet, the tunnel widened. The walls opened outward into a broad chamber carved long ago by cooling lava. The lantern glow climbed the rock walls but could not reach the ceiling. Warren took another step, and then he noticed the light. It did not come from the lantern. High above, a thin crack in the basalt roof let a narrow beam of daylight spill into the chamber. The pale shaft of sunlight cut cleanly through the darkness and landed on the cave floor in a bright oval. Dust floated slowly through the beam. Warren stepped into the light and looked up. The opening was narrow, just a fracture where time and weather had split the rock above. Then he heard something else, a soft, steady sound. Drip, drip, drip. Along one wall of the chamber, clear water slipped through a seam in the basalt and fell slowly onto the stone floor. A shallow depression had formed there over many years. Warren knelt and touched the water, cold, clean. He stood again and pressed his palm against the rock wall beside him. The stone was not frozen, the way surface rock usually was in the morning. It held a steady coolness. Not the sharp bite of winter air. Something steadier. Warren remained in the circle of sunlight for a long moment, studying the chamber. Water, stone, light. Three things the outside valley had stopped giving him. He looked once more at the basalt walls surrounding the chamber and spoke quietly to the empty cave. Stone keeps its own weather. Warren Hale remained standing in the quiet chamber, the lantern hanging at his side. The cave no longer felt like a tomb. Now it felt like a puzzle. He studied the three things the rock had revealed. The beam of sunlight falling through the fracture above, the slow drip of water slipping down the basalt wall, and the steady air held inside the stone. Outside, Red Hollow Basin froze hard in winter and burned dry in summer. The land swung between extremes. But inside the cave, the rock softened those changes. Stone held the night's warmth. Stone held the day's cool. Warren had worked long enough around furnaces and iron to understand what thick material could do. Heat moved slowly through solid mass, and basalt was nothing if not mass. His eyes drifted to the small sack leaning against the cave wall. Barley seed, the last seed he owned. Barley was stubborn grain. It survived colder ground than corn. It sprouted where other crops refused. Warren looked back to the oval of sunlight on the floor. If there were soil here, if there were fertilizer, if the water from the wall could keep the ground damp, then perhaps the grain would not care whether the sky was above it or 70 feet away. The thought was simple, not hopeful, just logical. Warren crossed the chamber and rested one hand on the small sack of seed. For the first time since the gavel fell in the courthouse, the future offered a narrow path forward. Barley, planted inside the earth itself. The idea itself was simple. The work was not. Warren Hale stepped outside the cave and studied the ground around the granite ridge. What little soil remained in Red Hollow Basin lay in thin patches between slabs of rock and dry scrub. Years of drought had stripped most of it away. Still, there was some. A few inches here, a few inches there. Enough, perhaps, if a man was stubborn. Warren lifted the broken coal shovel he had carried from the old farm. The blade was chipped along one edge, and the wooden handle had been repaired twice with wire. It would have to do. He drove the shovel into the ground. The soil resisted. The first few inches came away easily enough. After that, the blade struck stone again and again, sending dull vibrations up his arms. Warren did not rush. He cut shallow squares of earth, one patch at a time, and pushed the loose soil into a burlap sack. When the sack was full, he dragged it toward the cave. 70 feet. That was the distance from the entrance to the sunlit chamber. 70 feet of uneven rock. 70 feet of slow, grinding effort. The sack grew heavier with every step inside the cave. The gravel shifted under his boots. The air grew cooler. The lantern light shook against the walls as he pulled the weight behind him. At the chamber floor, he dumped the soil beneath the shaft of sunlight. Then he walked back outside and did it again. Day after day, the pattern repeated. Dig, fill, drag. The skin on Warren's hands split open during the first week. The shovel handle rubbed the wounds raw until thick calluses began forming over the torn skin. His back stiffened, his shoulders burned, but the pile of soil slowly grew. During the second week, Warren noticed movement near the deeper cracks of the chamber ceiling. Dark shapes clung to the rock above, barely visible in the lantern light. Bats? Where bats lived, something else followed. Warren found it along the far wall of the cave. Old, dry deposits layered along the stone floor beneath their roost. Bat guano. He crouched beside the pile and rubbed some of the powder between his fingers. Strong fertilizer. He had seen farmers use manure all his life. The principle was the same, so the system grew. Each load of soil from outside was mixed with the guano scraped from the cave floor. Then Warren added a third ingredient, fine gray ash from his fire pit near the entrance. Soil, guano, ash. He turned the mixture with the broken shovel until the earth darkened and softened. 3 weeks passed before the first raised bed finally took shape beneath the beam of sunlight. The rectangle was not large, 8 feet long, 2 feet wide, but it was real soil, resting on bare stone. Warren stood back and studied it quietly. Then he returned to work. A second bed formed beside the first, then a third. 4 weeks after the idea had first taken hold in his mind, the chamber floor held 3 long strips of dark earth positioned carefully beneath the arc of sunlight that moved slowly across the cave each day. The work had cost him skin, muscle, and more energy than any harvest he had ever planted, but the result remained. 3 narrow gardens inside solid rock. Warren rested the shovel against the cave wall and wiped the dirt from his hands. He studied the beds in silence for a long moment. No smile crossed his face. No celebration followed. He simply gave one small nod of approval. The soil was ready. 4 weeks of hauling soil and mixing earth inside the cave left Warren Hale with one problem he could not solve alone. The lantern oil was nearly gone. Without light, the work would slow. Without salt, the small meals he carried with him would not last long. And the old axe he had brought from the farm had begun to split along its worn handle. So one gray morning he walked the 6 miles back toward Dry Ridge. The town appeared the same as always, 2 dusty streets, a few wagons tied near the hitching rails, and the familiar wooden sign of Jonas Bell, the town's storekeeper and dry goods merchant. Inside the store, the smell of flour sacks and lamp oil filled the air. Jonas Bell stood behind the counter, marking figures in a narrow ledger. He looked up as Warren stepped through the door. For a moment, the merchant seemed mildly surprised to see him alive and standing. Warren placed his small list of needs on the counter. "A gallon of lamp oil," he said quietly. "Salt, and an axe head, if you've got one." Jonas gathered the items without much conversation. The merchant had seen too many hard years in Red Hollow to ask questions he did not need answered. But someone else had questions. The door opened again behind Warren. A broad-shouldered farmer stepped in from the wind, brushing dust from his coat. Calder Pike, a cattleman whose pasture bordered Warren's old fields. Calder studied him with open curiosity. "So it's true then," he said after a moment. "Heard you moved out to that rock ridge." Warren nodded once. "Living in that cave out there?" Another nod. Calder leaned his elbow on a barrel and let out a short laugh. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "Man gives up a farm and moves underground." A few men near the flour sacks chuckled quietly. Calder tilted his head toward Warren. "What are you planting out there, Hale?" His grin widened. "Stone?" The room filled with low laughter. Warren counted the last of his coins and set them on the counter one by one. The metal clicked softly against the wood. Then he gathered the oil and salt into his pack. Before leaving, he looked once at Calder Pike. His voice stayed calm. "A man plants where the ground allows." The line hung in the air for a moment. Calder snorted and shook his head. As Warren stepped toward the door, the farmer called after him, "Barley doesn't grow in rock." The laughter followed Warren out into the wind. The wind that carried Warren Hale back across the basin did not bother him. He had already heard worse inside the cave. By the time he reached the granite ridge again, the sun was leaning toward the western hills. The hens clucked softly when he returned, shifting inside their crate near the cave entrance. Warren carried the lamp oil and salt inside, set them near the wall, and walked straight toward the chamber, where the 3 beds of dark soil waited under the shaft of daylight. The place smelled different now, not like cold rock anymore. It smelled faintly of earth. Warren knelt beside the first bed and opened the small sack of barley seed. The grains were plain things, small, hard, a dull yellow-gray color, like dry straw ground into stone. He scooped a handful into his palm and studied them for a moment. Barley had survived hard seasons before. That was the only reason it had been saved. Warren leaned forward and pressed the first seed into the soil, 1.5 inches deep. No guessing, just the spacing he had used in fields many years before, 3 rows across each bed, 8 feet from one end to the other. He worked slowly, not careful in the way hopeful men are careful. Careful in the way a man works when hope has already failed him once and he refuses to be fooled again. Seed after seed disappeared beneath the dark soil. When the planting was finished, Warren rose and walked to the wall where the thin stream of water slipped down the basalt seam. He dipped a dented tin cup beneath the drip. Then he returned to the beds. The water was poured carefully, a small arc at a time, just enough to dampen the soil. No more. Too much water would drown the seed. Too little would leave it dry beneath the rock. The cave helped him here. The stone walls held moisture the way a cellar holds cool air. When the watering was done, Warren sat on a flat rock beside the beds. The shaft of sunlight slowly crossed the chamber floor as the day passed. Warren did nothing. He did not dig. He did not speak. He simply watched the soil, where the seeds lay buried. 3 days passed that way. On the third morning, Warren knelt beside the first bed again. The soil looked almost unchanged. Almost. Near the center of the row, a thin crack had opened in the surface. He leaned closer. A tiny green shoot had forced its way through the dark earth. The first barley plant. Warren reached out and touched the fragile leaf with the tip of one finger. He said nothing, but the experiment had begun. The barley did not grow the way barley usually grows. Out in open fields, wind pushes against the stalks. Rain hardens them. Sunlight spreads evenly across the rows. None of that existed inside the cave. Here there was only stone. The young plants rose slowly from the dark beds beneath the narrow shaft of daylight. Their color was different from ordinary barley. The green was paler, almost silver in the dim light of the chamber. The stems stretched upward with a quiet urgency. Every stalk leaned toward the fracture in the cave ceiling where the sunlight entered. The plants did not grow in straight rows the way they did under an open sky. They leaned, all of them, reaching for the same narrow window of light. There was no wind inside the chamber to strengthen them. Without wind, the thin stems sometimes bent under their own weight. Warren solved that problem with string. He tied simple guidelines between 2 iron spikes he had hammered into cracks in the rock. The lines ran gently above the beds, giving the fragile stalks something to lean against. Each evening, when the natural light disappeared from the chamber floor, Warren brought the lantern closer to the plants. He did not try to replace the sun. That would have been foolish, but he gave them a few more hours of weak light before the night closed over the cave again. It was not much, just enough. The system did not need perfection. It needed survival. Days passed in the steady rhythm of observation. Water from the wall, light from the fracture above, still air held inside the basalt. 3 weeks after the first shoots had appeared, Warren noticed a change near the tops of the tallest stalks. Small clusters had formed along the stems, barley heads. He stepped into the bed carefully and bent one stalk toward the lantern. The young head was still soft and green. Warren pinched it gently between his fingers. Then he rubbed it slowly between his thumb and forefinger. The husk broke open. Inside were the first forming grains. Tiny, but real, grain. Inside the cave, the barley heads thickened slowly over the following days, not as full as the grain that once grew in Warren Hale's old fields. Not golden in the way harvest grain glows under an open sky. But the stalks held weight now, and weight meant food. Warren waited until the heads had dried enough to rattle softly when touched. Then, one quiet afternoon, he stepped carefully into the bed with a small knife in his hand. The blade had once belonged to his forge shop. It was meant for cutting leather straps and trimming rope. Today, it would harvest grain. He worked slowly, one stalk at a time. The chamber was silent, except for the faint sound of steel sliding through dry stems. Each cut barley head fell into the cloth sack, resting beside him. There was no rush. The harvest was small. But it was real. When the cutting was finished, Warren carried the sack back to the cave entrance, where the fire pit waited. He spread the barley heads across a flat slab of basalt and began the old work of separating grain from husk. The heads were struck gently against the stone, again and again. With every strike, the dry husks cracked and the small barley kernels fell free. They gathered in a shallow pile on the rock. When enough grain had collected, Warren placed 2 smooth stones beside the fire. One served as a base, the other as the grinder. He poured the kernels between them and began to crush them slowly. The grinding sound was steady. Stone against stone, grain becoming meal. The result was coarse barley flour, pale and rough, but clean. Warren poured a handful into a small iron pot and mixed it with water from the cave wall. The pot rested over the low fire, while the mixture thickened. A soft smell rose with the steam, not rich, but honest. The porridge thickened into a simple meal. Warren lifted the pot from the fire and sat beside the cave wall. He ate slowly, measuring every bite. Food meant time. Time meant survival. When the pot was half empty, he stopped. The remaining portion was set aside carefully. A man who had lost everything did not celebrate a harvest. He studied the small bowl of barley porridge for a moment, then nodded once and spoke quietly to the empty cave. "That will do." Autumn moved quietly across Red Hollow Basin. The first cold wind slipped down from the northern ridges, brushing the dry grass flat and carrying the smell of snow from mountains far beyond the valley. In the town of Dry Ridge, people prepared the way they always had. Wood was stacked against house walls. Barn doors were repaired. Fences were checked before the cattle were driven closer to shelter. In the fields beyond town, farmers gathered the last of their grain. What little the drought had allowed to grow was cut and bundled before the frost could take it. No one in Dry Ridge believed the land had changed. They believed the seasons still worked the same way they always had. Even Calder Pike, whose pasture stretched along the western road, continued speaking about Warren Hale's cave with the same amused disbelief. The story had traveled through town now. A farmer living underground. A man growing barley in rock. Calder repeated it more than once inside Jonas Bell's store. Each time the laughter sounded the same. Out in the basin, the valley itself listened in silence. The wind strengthened. The air sharpened. Dark clouds began forming beyond the northern hills where winter storms were born. Warren Hale paid no attention to the talk in town. Inside the cave, the work continued. The first harvest had proven something important. Not that the system was perfect, only that it worked, so he expanded it. 2 more beds were carved from the chamber floor beside the original 3. Soil was hauled again. Guano mixed again. Ash spread again. 5 long beds of dark earth now rested beneath the shifting arc of light. Above them, the crack in the rock still delivered its narrow beam of daylight. Outside the cave, the sky darkened. A slow wall of cloud rolled across the ridgeline and drifted over Red Hollow Basin. The valley watched it come, and the wind began to change. The storm did not arrive gently. It came out of the north like a door kicked open. The first wind struck Red Hollow Basin just after sunset. It rolled down the mountain passes with a long, rising howl that bent the dry grass flat and rattled the wooden siding of every house in Dry Ridge. Within an hour, the temperature dropped sharply. Within 2 hours, the sky disappeared. Snow began falling sideways, driven by wind that never seemed to slow. The flakes were fine and hard, more like blowing sand than winter snow. 3 hours after the storm began, the road leading out of Dry Ridge vanished beneath, drifting white. Tracks disappeared. Fence lines vanished. The valley itself seemed to dissolve. By morning, the storm had thickened. The wind did not rest. Snow piled against barns and sheds. Gates froze shut. Cattle huddled against windbreaks, while the storm roared across the open ground. By the second day, the drifts had grown deep enough to swallow a man to his waist. Roofs began to strain under the weight. One old cattle barn collapsed along the southern pasture. The heavy beams snapped and vanished beneath a rolling cloud of snow. Men in Dry Ridge fought the storm with shovels and axes, but the wind fought harder. By the third day, several houses had lost sections of roof. Chimneys clogged with drifting snow. Firewood piles shrank faster than anyone expected. The storm did not pause. It did not weaken. By the 5th day, Dry Ridge had almost stopped moving. Doors were buried. Paths were gone. The town was cut off from every road leading out of the basin. Nature had taken control of the valley. 70 feet inside the basalt ridge, Warren Hale heard the storm as little more than a distant murmur. The wind still passed through the narrow passages of the cave, but the thick stone walls softened its voice. What sounded like violence outside arrived inside the chamber as a low, hollow whisper. The fire near the entrance burned steadily. The basalt around the chamber held the temperature almost unchanged. The cold outside never fully reached the garden beds beneath the fracture of light. Water continued dripping from the seam in the wall. The hens clucked quietly near their wooden crate and scratched at the gravel floor. One of them laid an egg on the second morning of the storm. Warren collected it without ceremony and placed it beside the sack of barley flour. The grain from the cave beds remained dry. The small harvest he had gathered rested in a cloth sack near the rock wall, untouched by wind or frost. Outside, the storm hammered the valley for 5 relentless days. Inside the cave, the rhythm of work continued. Water, grain, fire, stone. When the wind finally began to weaken, Warren walked toward the entrance of the lava tube and pushed aside the wooden barrier he had braced across the opening. The door scraped against packed snow. Cold air rushed in. Warren stepped forward and looked out across Red Hollow Basin. The valley had disappeared. Everything, fields, fences, roads, rooftops, had been swallowed beneath a vast sheet of white. Nature had finished its judgment, and the storm had chosen its winners. For 2 days, after the storm ended, Red Hollow Basin remained silent. The wind had gone, but the damage remained. Snow packed hard across the valley floor, sealing roads and burying fences beneath long white ridges. Smoke rose slowly from the chimneys of Dry Ridge, thin and uncertain. The storm had passed. The consequences had not. Inside the basalt cave, Warren Hale continued the same routine that had carried him through the 5 days of wind. The hens were fed. The water seam was checked. The barley beds were inspected beneath the thin beam of winter light. The cave held its steady air the way it always had. Stone did not hurry. Stone did not panic. Late that afternoon, a sound broke the quiet. 3 dull knocks struck the wooden brace. Warren had set across the cave entrance. The noise echoed faintly down the passage. Warren set aside the small iron pot he had been cleaning and walked toward the entrance. Cold air leaked through the cracks around the door. Another knock followed. He lifted the brace and pulled the door open just enough to see outside. A man stood in the snow. The wind had carved pale lines across his face, and frost clung to the edges of his coat. Calder Pike, the man who had once leaned against a flour barrel in Jonas Bell's store and laughed about barley growing in rock. The laughter was gone now. Calder's eyes looked older. His voice came slowly, as if the words had to push through the cold. "The barn roof collapsed," he said. The breath left his mouth in a cloud. Feed got buried. What grain we had left froze solid. He hesitated. "My youngest hasn't eaten since yesterday." Calder's gaze shifted past Warren's shoulder. Inside the cave, he could see the fire glowing against the stone wall. He could see the crate of hens. And further inside, beneath the narrow shaft of light, he could see the dark beds of barley, real grain, growing where no field existed. Calder Pike stared into the chamber without speaking. Then, slowly, he removed his hat. The man who had laughed now stood bareheaded in the snow. Calder Pike remained standing in the snow for a long moment, his hat hanging in his hands. The wind had quieted, but the cold still pressed hard against the valley. Inside the cave, the fire cracked softly. Warren Hale studied the man without speaking. He had known Calder for years. They had traded tools, shared fence repairs, and once helped pull a wagon from a spring flood. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was arithmetic, food, wood, time. Calder spoke first. "I came to ask if you might spare some flour," he said, his voice rough from the cold. Warren considered the words. Then he shook his head once. "I don't give it away," he said calmly. Calder looked up. Warren stepped aside and pointed deeper into the cave, where the barley bed stretched beneath the narrow winter light. "That grain took a month of hauling soil and 4 weeks of growing," he said. "Stone doesn't grow food for free." He paused. "But I'll trade." Calder waited. "Barley flour for firewood," Warren continued. cut and stacked here at the cave. The terms were simple. 1 week of grain, Warren said, for 1 month of wood. Calder thought only a moment before nodding. I can do that. The agreement was sealed, without a handshake. Calder turned and walked back toward the valley, leaving deep tracks in the snow behind him. By the next morning, word had spread through Dry Ridge. The cave in the basalt ridge had food, and the man living inside it had terms. Before noon, another figure appeared through the drifting snow. Then another. A leather worker arrived first, offering to repair the torn straps on Warren's tool belt. A carpenter followed, carrying a bundle of split boards for strengthening the cave door. Later that afternoon, a former blacksmith brought a set of sharpened iron wedges in exchange for barley flour. One by one, the people of Dry Ridge came to the cave, not to laugh, to trade. By evening, the sound of chopping wood echoed across the ridge. Calder Pike swung an axe beside the cave entrance, splitting frozen logs into neat stacks against the basalt wall. The man who once mocked barley and stone now worked to keep the fire beneath it burning. Winter did not leave Red Hollow Basin all at once. It loosened its grip, slowly. The deep drifts began to shrink beneath a pale spring sun. Roofs emerged first, then fences. Then the long white fields softened back into the dull gray earth that had always struggled to feed the valley. The storm had passed, but people in Dry Ridge remembered what had carried them through it. One quiet afternoon, Jonas Bell walked the path up the granite ridge to the cave. He carried a small bundle under one arm. Salt, lamp oil, trade goods. Jonas stepped inside and paused, letting his eyes adjust to the dim chamber. The cave looked the same as it had through the winter. Fire near the entrance, barley beds beneath the fracture of sunlight. Warren Hale knelt beside the soil, pressing fresh seeds into the dark earth. Jonas set the bundle down beside the wall. For a moment, he simply watched the quiet work. Then he cleared his throat. "I misjudged the rock," he said. Warren did not answer. He finished pressing the final barley seed into the soil and brushed the dirt from his hands. The narrow beam of light still fell across the beds. Outside, the valley began another year. Inside the cave, Warren prepared for the next winter. He stood slowly, looked once at the small green shoots beginning again beneath the stone ceiling, and said quietly, "Winter will come again. And maybe that is the real lesson of Red Hollow. Sometimes the land everyone calls worthless simply hasn't met the right mind yet." Do you think barley could really save a town if it grew inside a cave?